Welcome to No Apologies. I'm Dana Lash. After September 11th, 2001, when the Twin Towers in New York were brought down by Islamic hijackers, killing 3,000 Americans and stunning the world, there were, of course, demands that something had to be done. It was a totally understandable reaction. The images were horrific. The death toll was staggering. And of course, we didn't like finding out, as we did on 9/11, that we were that vulnerable in a free society. That men with some rudimentary flight lessons, a few box cutters, and a willingness to die for their beliefs could inflict that much damage. So people screamed for more government safeguards and more protection. After all, if the towers in New York had come down, what attack might happen next? So we were in the middle of a war on terror. And again, this was an understandable reaction. Of course, they never did anything about the immigration laws that led to this in the first place, but I digress. America was shaken to its core. Well, what happened next is that the American government then began to change its orientation towards its own citizens. Namely, it became suddenly permissible for the government to begin to collect information on its own people. Or to put it bluntly, it became permissible to spy on Americans in the name of safety. And we can't lay this problem at the feet of the Democrats solely because President Bush and Republicans were part of it. So immediately, President Bush signed the PATRIOT Act, and the NSA was allowed to start a special collections program to track the communications of al-Qaeda leaders and terrorists. Now, the PATRIOT Act contained a number of provisions, which included giving unprecedented power to the National Security Agency, the NSA, and letting the FBI actually search telephone, email, and financial records of American citizens via FISA court orders. This was all reported on by Glenn Greenwald in 2013 for The Guardian. Now, these FISA court hearings, these are done. Now, FISA, obviously, when NSA conducts surveillance, FISA oversees that surveillance aspect of NSA. But all of these hearings, everything was done behind closed doors, and the warrants are granted by a judge. There's nobody there. You don't get to face the people who are accusing you. It's not like the due process that we know, right? Nobody gets to stand up for the person being targeted for surveillance by an intelligence agency. That's a pretty un-American process, I might add. And it's simply, judges call whether or not they're going to grant an agency like the FBI permission to spy on someone like, for instance, Carter Page, an innocent American citizen who just happened to work with the Trump administration. Actually, during the campaign part of the process. And that was all during the run-up to the Trump presidency. So Carter Page, he was a citizen he was advising the Trump campaign. He was working with the Trump campaign in a private civilian fashion. Well, he ended up being spied on by our own government because they wanted to spy on Trump. So a FISA warrant was issued on Carter Page, and it was based on falsified information from FBI agents. In fact, here's the funny thing. The FBI actually had altered CIA emails that at one point the CIA had said Carter Page is actually an asset for us against the Russian government. And in order to get this warrant, the FBI actually omitted this. They edited the CIA emails, these documents, in their application for this FISA warrant and presented it to the FISA court without disclosing any of this. And it's why two of them ended up being suspended. One was placed on probation. That was the attorney for these FBI agents because they were all lying. Now, the FISA judge in particular, there was one FISA judge in particular that approved this request to spy on Carter Page. You have multiple judges, but one judge was warned about it repeatedly. And this is what journalist Glenn Greenwald had reported about. This was in 2013. He said, quote, "The truth is that FISA Judge Collier and the FISA court is just as culpable for putting the U.S. through the Russiagate nightmare as the FBI. Judge Collier allowed Carter Page to go through 3 years of personal hell despite the fact that he was an honest public servant. Was she biased, lazy, or just protecting her turf? In the end, it doesn't matter because her job was to protect the freedom of Americans, and she failed. Judge Collier resigned her position as presiding judge on the FISA court," end quote. So surveillance of U.S. citizens, which started way back in 2001 with the Patriot Act as a way to prevent terrorism, was now being used as a way to take out a presidential candidate. Now, so think about that. The FBI was using its own powers to surveil a U.S. citizen. This was all to settle a political score. They were hoping that through surveillance of the citizen, maybe they could find or at least somewhat beg the question of dirt on a presidential candidate that the swamp didn't like. And of course, Trump was that candidate. They persecuted Carter Page for 3 years with no apology. And Carter Page he was innocent. And those lovebird FBI agents, you remember Peter Strzok, who looks like an elf on the shelf, and Lisa Page? They turned out to be Democrat partisans who were texting each other. I mean, quite literally, they had their phones out texting each other. Every time Trump spoke, they were talking about taking out an insurance policy against the possibility of Trump ever being elected. And of course, that insurance policy was using that discredited Steele dossier to obtain FISA warrants to spy on Carter Page and the Trump campaign. So sidebar to all of this, you all remember that it was Fusion GPS, which was at the time actually lobbying on behalf of Russian oligarchs to get the Magnitsky Act repealed. And the Magnitsky Act was based on a whistleblower that had told the U.S. government about some extortion scheme that the Russian government was involved in. So Fusion GPS was already operating in violation of FARA, even though it's like rarely prosecuted, they still violated it. And they were working also for the DNC. They were hired by the DNC to work for the Hillary Clinton campaign, and then they hired a British spy who had fallen out of good graces with the British government to go to the Kremlin, and work with Russian adversaries to the United States to come up with all kinds of like gossip. They thought that maybe if they were able to get it from Russia, that would have some sort of legitimacy. And then they leaked that to reporters, and we know of this because of documentation that was released via FOIA requests. And ultimately, a lot of those journalists had their names redacted from those documents, which are still available online. That information was leaked out to the press. That resulted in news articles. Those news articles were added to the application to get the warrant from the FISA court. You trust your government? So, of course, the entire Russian hoax collapsed. And you actually had people who got in trouble for this, that lost their jobs over this, that were put on probation for this. And Robert Mueller and the independent counsel spent over $40 million, and they wasted 3 years, all to settle a political score and cast some shadow over the Trump presidency. They produced nothing of substance. It was all a scam. If anything, it showed how absolutely corrupted our intelligence agencies had become. So we give all of this as context, because now it seems that our intelligence agencies may be doing it again, playing partisan games, wielding power at American citizens they dislike. This time, it's the NSA. Now remember, their domestic surveillance comes under jurisdiction of FISA. Now the NSA is now being accused of surveilling Tucker Carlson, my friend Tucker Carlson of Fox News. So this is what Tucker had to say the other day. Watch.
Yesterday, we heard from a whistleblower within the U.S. government who reached out to warn us that the NSA, the National Security Agency, is monitoring our electronic communications and is planning to leak them in an attempt to take this show off the air. Now, that's a shocking claim, and ordinarily we'd be skeptical of it. It's illegal for the NSA to spy on American citizens. It's a crime. It's not a third world country. Things like that should not happen in America. But unfortunately, they do happen, and in this case, they did happen. The whistleblower, who is in a position to know, repeated back to us information about a story that we are working on that could have only come directly from my texts and emails. There's no other possible source for that information, period.
So, of course, naturally, the left immediately began saying that Carlson was a conspiracy theorist. Now, I understand if your political beliefs prevent you from taking him at his word. I get it. But why in the world would you take the NSA at their word when they issued this statement via Twitter? Interestingly enough, they also disabled replies to this tweet. They said, quote, Tucker Carlson alleged that the National Security Agency has been monitoring our electronic communications and is planning to leak them in an attempt to take this show off air. This allegation is untrue. Tucker Carlson has never been an intelligence target of the agency, and the NSA has never had any plans to try to take his program off the air. NSA has a foreign intelligence mission. We target foreign powers to generate insights on foreign activities that could harm the United States. With limited exceptions, NSA may not target a U.S. citizen without a court order that explicitly authorizes the targeting, end quote. Yeah, that's a lie. That is an absolute lie. And we're not at all convinced by this non-denial issued by NSA. The wording feels really specific, and purposely so. This is the obligatory denial, non-denial. And by the way, the NSA can absolutely surveil citizens without warrants. They say that they're not supposed to, but there are loopholes if they're doing any kind of foreign surveillance and it happens to catch U.S. people, their communications up in this, that can also be included. And Barack Obama talked about this to Charlie Rose back in 2013, and he was bragging about how they were able to do that. So yes, we already know that this whole entire FISA warrant process can be abused 6 ways to Sunday. And we know that it's been done before for partisan reasons, as I just explained. And all of this to say, I don't trust our intel agencies. I haven't trusted government agencies since I lived in my home state of Missouri, and our Democrat governor at the time, Jay Nixon, along with the Missouri Highway Patrol, targeted dissenting Americans as domestic terrorists for flying Gadsden flags with the now memory-hold MIAC report that I reported on at the time, both on air, when I started radio in 2008, and online. And not since government agencies formed the quote-unquote truth squad to police speech during the 2008 general election in Missouri. They did that with then prosecutor Jennifer Joyce and also a left-leaning sheriff and Bob McCullough. You all remember Bob McCullough because he was the attorney who was involved in the Mike Brown case. Bob McCullough, before that, had a lot of fame in the area because he was a member of that Obama truth squad. And of course, the IRS, not since the IRS under former President Obama targeted Tea Party groups. They settled for millions, by the way. And not since the ATF and the Obama administration tried using their gun walking scandal fast and furious as a way to implement more gun control. You get the idea. And a sidebar to that, because everyone loves to bring up Operation Wide Receiver under former President George W. Bush, the difference between Operation Wide Receiver and Fast and Furious is that Wide Receiver, both were stupid programs, except under the Bush administration, they realized that Wide Receiver was stupid earlier. And under Fast and Furious, they also shut Operation Wide Receiver down. But not Fast and Furious. Not only did they allow that to go, they didn't track the guns, they didn't even write down the serial numbers, they didn't follow any of it. They just let it go. And they used it to justify calling for more gun control. Yeah, so you can see why I question my government. Our founders set this government up very specifically to keep its own power in check. They wanted to protect the liberty and the privacy of citizens above all else. But that system has been corrupted for our safety. Do we think Tucker Carlson's being targeted? I mean, I've known Tucker for 10 years. I trust him more than I do the NSA. So this government has done it before many times. And if you're not worried about it, you should be. And don't think that it's okay because it's someone that you dislike. When the Patriot Act was passed, all of this data collection was supposedly going to be done against foreign enemies or against terrorists, remember? Yeah, I was against it from the beginning. And guess who the Biden administration says is the greatest terrorist threat in America today? It's domestic terrorists called white supremacists. And if you notice, they never actually define what that actually is. All we know is they wear red hats, and apparently they all voted for Trump. So that could be anybody. Increasingly, a so-called white supremacist, the Biden administration, especially with critical race theory, it honestly, they make it sound like anybody who holds any conservative values, anybody who likes America, anybody who voted for Trump, who likes Eagles, apple pie, maybe even baseball, who knows. That should worry you, even if you're not a Republican. Why? Because who the government decides is an enemy today can change tomorrow. Yesterday, the enemy of the state was so-called Islamic terrorists, and today it's American citizens, those so-called white supremacist terrorists, which increasingly seems to be describing anybody who opposes this administration. Tomorrow, it could be you. Don't think it can happen, that it can't happen. I have friends who've gone through this, have been targeted by the alphabet agencies of government simply because they stood up either to protect voting rolls or they spoke out against tyranny in their own local areas. Political purges perpetuated by the iron fist of government, they never stop once they start, and they never end anywhere good. At first, you look the other way, thinking it's not me the government's after, but eventually it will be you that they're after. And eventually you'll be on the wrong side of an issue. You'll be associated with the wrong person, according to just some government agency, just like Carter Page. And then you'll become a target of the state. And if the intelligence agencies, if they decide to ruin your reputation or take out your show, like maybe they're trying to do to Tucker Carlson, who knows, by leaking some text, some voicemail or email, you better believe they can do it. So you should take it, regardless of what side of the political aisle you fall on. You should take that accusation very seriously and be consistent in your application of liberty and government responsibility. And unless you're naive about the tendency for the government to abuse its power, you should take this seriously. We're living in some pretty treacherous times. You must be vigilant. And if America is to remain, well, America, our intelligence agencies cannot be weaponized for partisan purposes. There's supposed to be safeguards in place to prevent this, but there's always a loophole, right? They should never, under any circumstance, target any religion or party or any other group for political reasons, no matter who is in power. So let's hope that our representatives take this accusation by Carlson seriously and look into it. And not just for Carlson's sake, but for all of ours. Coming up, we discuss the systematic con behind wokeism with Victor Davis Hanson. Keep it here. Black Rifle Coffee Company is a veteran-owned coffee company that serves premium coffee to people who love America. Veteran CEO, founder, and American ass kicker Evan Hafer spent over 7 years on the ground overseas with U.S. Special Forces and as a CIA contractor. Black Rifle Coffee is committed to Evan's mission of supporting veteran, law enforcement, and of course, first responder causes. So this summer, Black Rifle Coffee Company invites you to enjoy your coffee. Whether you're brewing the perfect cup of pour over as you get ready to launch all your Roman candles, or whether you're just, you're cracking open a can of 300 on your next backcountry mission, or maybe just to spend a day at the grill celebrating our independence, Black Rifle Coffee is here to fuel your way wherever the summer takes you. I hear it's Talon roasted by bald eagles. So head to blackriflecoffee.com/DanaTV to order yours and use code DanaTV at checkout for 20% off your purchase in your first coffee club order. Fuel your summer with America's coffee. Black Rifle Coffee. Wokeism has become the latest trend in American culture, sadly, and there doesn't seem to be an end in sight. Now, my next guest says that there is a systemic con behind it, and he's here to break it down. Victor Davis Hanson is a senior fellow for the Hoover Institution, professor, author, and of course his book, The Case for Trump, a must read. He joins me now. Victor, it's great to have you. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Dana.
Of course. I've read a number of your pieces, and I loved what you had actually been, well, and we're going to get to all of that, because I love what you were talking about, the grift that is being perpetuated by some of the Black Lives Matter leaders. I wanted to, though, really quickly get your thoughts on this article that came from Vice today about Robert Johnson from BET, the CEO of BET. He says that he's calling for $14 trillion in reparations and saying that, at first it was just the atonement, but now that there's a monetary aspect. He said it was always supposed to be twofold. And this to me brings up so many questions about, first, even if people were going to buy into this, and this is something that they were actually going to try to achieve with any level of practicality, there's no way that you could even do it. What is your thought about this, and someone that influential, who's a billionaire, calling for something like this?
Yeah, I don't think that he's serious, because these things were raised right before 9/11, and then they were overshadowed by that disaster and catastrophe. And we had about 5 years of discussing it, and the things that came up were pretty damning. I mean, who is black? Is it somebody who's 40%, 50%, 70%, 10%? Do we really want to go back to the whole Elizabeth Warren, Rachel Dolezal, Ward Churchill phenomenon? Do we need DNA badges? If somebody comes from Nigeria, is he going to get reparations because he feels he's discriminated against right here and now? With $30 trillion in debt? Are the Irish going to say that in 1851 they were called non-white? How about the Japanese internment? They've already got their 20,000. What about the yellow peril? Latinos say that they couldn't buy homes in certain districts of California up until 1955. We could go through this ad nauseum. And then there's the other practical reality. We're $30 trillion in debt. It's not like we have all this money. And so then are we going to say, and then if you're on the other side, a lot of people say, okay, we're going to find every tribal group and find their pluses and minuses. So let's do this. Let's go and look at all the money for the last 60 years of society and see which particular groups got more federal money than they paid in tax. People can say in rare, interracial, intertribal, interethnic, which group has had more people from that group. And now what I'm emulating and I'm not being completely facetious, but that's what they did in the former Yugoslavia between World War I and World War II. In Eastern Europe, what they did in Lebanon, that's what they do in Rwanda, that's what they did in Iraq. So you really want to go through each has competing claims of victimhood. And I don't think I think we've reached peak wokeism when we saw the spectacle of the third placed hammer throw athlete not looking at things. People just said, so tired of this, been there, done that. Colin Kaepernick, mediocre athlete, wants to get a sneakers contract, big deal, turn the channel. I think everybody's getting to that point.
Yeah, and it seems that a lot of people are pushing against. It's all part of this critical race theory, and there are a lot of parents. It's not just white parents; it's black parents. The addition of children being home for basically a year from school for lockdown, parents for the first time. I think a lot of parents really got to see some of this, the psychological. This brainwashing that the kids are getting in curriculum with critical race theory. And I think you may be right. It's pushing people over the top. Patrisse Cullors, who's head of BLM, I think that kind of also was a point of no return for a lot of people, especially in the black community, because there are victims that we have seen on television who they've had either loved ones, either it's gang violence, or maybe they weren't innocent. Maybe they were criminals and it was a police-involved shooting, or maybe who knows, justified homicide. There've been too many, my point, that have been speaking up against BLM, saying that you fundraised off of the death of our family member or our loved one, and now you have Patrisse Cullors, who has 3 homes in some of the whitest and the bougiest areas of California and elsewhere. That seemed to also, Mark, be a huge point of no return.
I think it is. I think we forgot that there is a huge class division, not just among whites, in the case of woke, but among minorities as well. I mean, when you have Oprah and her $90 million estate in Montecito lamenting and trading stories of victimization with Meghan Markle and her $16 million estate, nobody really feels that they're victims. Or Michelle coming out of her $14 million Martha's Vineyard and saying, oh, I was treated badly, or this, or Barack Obama coming out of his $8 million Colorama house. Nobody really has sympathy. So there's a sense that this is an elite phenomenon, a top-down, not a grassroots. These are academics, they're lawyers, they're activists, they're celebrities, they're athletes, LeBron, et cetera, but they don't deal with the real life issues in the inner city or even in the suburbs. When people in Portland or Seattle say, well, what am I going to do when I call 9/11? That's not really an act of racism, as you implied. And when you have all these leaders that just have disdain, I mean, Nicole Hannah-Jones says, looting it's just property, it's not violence. Or the mayor of Minneapolis says, well, it was just brick and mortar when you burned down, that doesn't matter. Or when we had the Seattle mayor say, well, they destroyed property, but it's a summer of love. So maybe that property belonged to a poor person who saved for 5 years to buy a car or a business. And so there's this, I think that's something the conservatives and the Republicans need to really focus on, the elite abyss between the woke cadre that is foisting this upon us and the results of it on all everyday people of every race.
Yeah, we're talking to Victor Davis Hanson. I love what you wrote in one of your recent pieces. You said, but the idea that your race or your appearance is incidental and not essential to who you are is a very radical idea, very biblical idea as well. Talk a little bit about that, because I don't think I had really viewed it in those terms before.
Well, there's not very many multiracial nations in history. They don't work because people's natural tendency is to be tribal. They feel more comfortable or safe by people who look superficially the same. And the places where that was not true, the Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Soviet Union was multiracial, but they used a level of violence and coercion to force people to give up their tribal identity. Tito, as long as Tito was alive as a communist strongman, there was no tribal violence in Yugoslavia. The moment he died, they couldn't keep the lid on the kettle. And so I think we got to realize that today in the world, there's only about 2 or 3 nations like us, India maybe, and Brazil, but they don't do a very good job. So rather than damning us because we're not perfect, I think people have to say, this was really an aberration, that these founders came from Britain and the English-speaking countries, Ireland or Scotland, and they came over here, and the first thing they did is they created an idea that would make themselves irrelevant. In other words, that all men are created equal, the natural trajectory of that idea, we go back and forth, we take 2 steps back, was what we have now. And I can't see anybody in history that's ever done that. A majority population said that our race, our religion, our appearance is not what we are. And so that's why people come here. And that's what I think, if everything the left has said during this woke moment were true, we wouldn't have 2 million people trying to get across the border who are not white. They know something that the elite are not telling us. Either they're disingenuous and they feel that, okay, we'll say it's racist, but we really deep down inside know it's not because these people want to get in here, or they're saying, well, as long as we call everybody racist, they will be so afraid they'll let in more immigrants, and the immigrants will change the demography and the electoral college dynamics. I don't know what they're doing, but when you look at immigration, that's a real strong refutation of the whole woke narrative.
Completely. And that goes into, how the founders envisioned this country, e pluribus unum, from out of many one. You have one with the identity of freedom and liberty, and that's really ultimately the only tribalism, really free people and individual liberty that should really be recognized. I wanted to ask you too. We're talking to Victor Davis Hanson while I have you, and I appreciate your time with us today. All of this, the woman who spoke up, and I believe this was in Loudoun County, Virginia, who was born in China, immigrated to the United States. She said, this is just like the Maoist Cultural Revolution. This is really what this is. And the purging of traditional iconography, getting the division between different subsects of people. We really have seen this done before. So why are so many people falling to it again?
That's a very good question, because I think if we could poll the actual woke leaders or the cadre who are doing this, I don't think it's more than 10 or 15% of the population. But that's not necessarily reassuring, because the Jacobins during the French Revolution had a very small percentage of the French revolutionary population behind them. But, for 18 months, they slaughtered people until finally they put them down. The Bolsheviks were a minority, but I think people are afraid, and they're afraid that they don't want to be canceled, and they'll go to the next person if they keep quiet. I think also you had a good point. I don't know the degree to which we could attribute cause and effect, but the fact that we had this COVID paranoia and 600,000 people dying, our first lockdown, our first artificially induced recession, the first time 62% of the people did not vote on election day. We've never even come close to that. The whole acrimony about the Trump phenomenon, and then the George Floyd in 120 days, I think it made everybody go collectively crazy. They were locked in their homes. They were communicating as you and I do. You can't see your expressions. You can't get an aura of them. And they sort of double down on their emotions and fears. And I think that's why, as we start to come out of this cocoon, the left is very scared, because I think we're still in the fumes of, well, Donald Trump was controversial and everybody's a racist, Trump, Trump, Trump. But once we get out and we see the real world as it was before COVID, people are going to be very angry at the border, or the crime rate, or the racial divisions, or the price of gas, etc. And that's why I think the Democrats are kind of fearful, because they say, well, Joe Biden's over 50%, but give 3 or 4 months of people returning to normal, I don't think he will be.
Ooh, that's a really good point. One last question for you, Victor. Your background in history, your background in strategy. How does this end? I mean, I'm trying not to be cynical, but you are giving me perhaps a little bit more optimism than maybe I've had in the past few weeks. But are we actually going to be in a position? Is there enough desire for liberty? Is there enough identification first as free people that in our lifetimes we're going to see a lot of this pushback? Or should we just be grateful that we're at the age where, if Marxism is fully realized in this country, we'll be dead and buried? I mean, there's no in between in there. What is your take?
Well, it's set up kind of like 2009 when Obama was supposed to be the wave of the future. Remember, we looked like FDR and Newsweek, and it was socialism. And then the Tea Party crushed that. And then it was sort of a surviving next 6 years, but he never got control of Congress again. If they take the midterms, the Republicans, I think Biden will become an executive order shrill president. And if people stand up and say, I don't care if you call me a racist, you can call me anything you want, it has zero effect, and they start implementing that ideology. They don't watch the NFL. They do not watch the NBA. They don't even turn on the Oscars. They forget about what Delta or Coke is. And they start to exercise their wrath, I think, because they're in the majority, that people make the necessary adjustments. And I think you're starting to see a little bit that the left is overreached, because it's not sustainable, Dana. You can't have a society in which people can't walk down the street without being assaulted, or a person is one word away from losing his entire career and his family's reputation, all of his money, salary, income. Societies don't work that way, and they don't work that way where you print $2 or $3 trillion a year either. So we have a lot of rendezvous with we're going to have a lot of gut check time coming up very soon.
Yeah, we absolutely will. Victor Davis Hanson, appreciate your time and your work as well. Thanks so much for joining me today. Good to see you.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. Coming up, another example of the American media's love affair with the Communist Chinese Party. You're not going to believe this. Gordon Chang, who also has a very, very thought-provoking piece in which he says, time to end trade with China, he joins us to discuss this and the insane ties Google has to the Wuhan lab. Keep it here. So CNN proved yet again that the American media is all in with the Communist Chinese Party. This was unbelievable, their tweet earlier. Gordon Chang, who's author of The Coming Collapse of China, he is an expert. This is his wheelhouse. He joins us to discuss this and the latest details, too, of this Wuhan lab cover-up. There's a lot of things to discuss. Gordon, always so good to see you and appreciate your time with us, even as you're traveling. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dana.
Of course. When I first saw this tweet from CNN where they were celebrating the, I guess, celebrations that the Communist Party of China was having, they said that Xi is going to be the real star as the Chinese Communist Party is about to turn 100. And the first person I thought of was, I wonder what Gordon Chang has to think about this. So I wanted to get your response to this.
Well, first of all, Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, is making himself the center of the country's celebrations, quote unquote, over the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party. But this is really a day of mourning. It's a day of mourning for the Chinese people. I mean, somewhere between 30 to 80 million people have been killed by the party. But it's also a day of mourning for the rest of the world because China poses a threat not just to democracy and freedom, not just to the United States, but to the whole concept of civilization. So today, July 1st, is going to be a day in China that is one of infamy.
Yeah, definitely. So you had a tweet earlier where you cited a piece that was written. This was in one of the, I believe it was China Global Times. It's one of the Beijing communist-run newspapers over in China. This was pretty amazing, and I thought you hit it on the head. Their headline was that, Anglo-Saxons commit genocide because it's in their genes. That's the narrative that the Communist Party of China is pushing. That was a piece that they actually put out. Very interesting, the way that they exploit any kind of tension or strife in the United States, and they really, really pour gas on that fire with a lot of the headlines that they have here. You say that they're trying to trigger, the Communist Party of China is trying to trigger a global race war. When you think about it, and you think of all their statements, that does seem like it. Your thoughts on this?
Yes, this is not just a one article that appeared. This article was primarily directed at Canada, but it also mentioned the United States. But it's not isolated, Dana. For instance, in mid-March, after China's top two diplomats went to Anchorage, immediately Beijing started a series of propaganda blasts that was timed with that high-level meeting that went after, quote-unquote, white supremacy of the United States, because they said that was the core of our relationships with our allies in Asia, which couldn't be further from the truth. But really what they were doing is, again, trying to bring up this whole notion of it's the whites against everybody else in Asia. And this harks back to the early 1930s when Japan had its Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which again was an attempt to divide the region along racial lines. China's trying to do that now. And one other thing, this dehumanization of quote unquote Anglo-Saxons really is, we've seen in history that statements like this, acts like this, are the prelude to the worst acts of humanity.
Oh, very much so. And of course, with the closure of Apple Daily, that was awful to read that news this week. Of course, a lot of articles about they're closing up shop. They can't exist anymore. And their founder, Jimmy Lai, was disappeared for a while, as everyone knows, sitting in a prison cell because I think his charge was something like unlawful or assembly or something bogus. But what else is left to get real news to the people of China now with the closure of Apple Daily? They were sort of the last source of this, and Jimmy Lai really put it all on the line.
Well, he certainly did. He didn't have to do this. He was a clothing billionaire retailing clothes, but he chose instead to talk about freedom and democracy. And now, as you point out, his assets have been taken away and he's sitting in a jail. And as a 73-year-old, they're going to be piling on even more charges. In Beijing's estimation, they can keep him for the rest of his life. And what the United States needs to do, to answer your question, is really to try to blast through China's information monopoly, because at this moment, China's attacking us. We've got to defend ourselves.
Yeah, got to defend ourselves. Jimmy Lai, I think that's one of the most inspirational stories. We always talk about the founders of America that put it all on the line, and I don't know many people who put as much on the line as Jimmy Lai has for freedom when they didn't have to. And to your point, I've been talking about your piece here with a group of friends in text, because I thought this is probably one of the most provocative pieces. But I agree with you on this, and I wanted to talk with you about it. You said that this is the time that the United States has to really speak out, really stand strong against communist China, and really defend, freedom. And you said cut off the blood supply to China's Communist Party in trade. The export-dependent China is an American-dependent China. Do we have a political class in this country that would even be able to do it? And could people be convinced? Your thoughts?
Well, President Trump broke 5 decades of engagement theory and was well on his way to radically restructuring our relationships with China. And that was a good thing. The question is, does the rest of the political establishment follow him? The answer is no. But Dana, we got to remember that it's the American people who know what we should be doing. And so we've got to push our political leaders around. Because we are the last line of defense. Because they're, Wall Street, Walmart, they're not going to defend us. We have Nike saying that the company is of China and for China. Well, we need to have people who believe that our companies and our institutions are for America and for democracy and freedom. It's as simple as that.
I think people need to be told that every single time they make a purchase. And I get that there's certain things, the chip war, especially right now, there's certain things it's very difficult, antibiotics and things of that nature. But every single purchase, people need to really think about it. Do you want to put money in the pocket of Xi Jinping, or do you want to make sure that that money goes towards, if not the United States, then, I always joke, Gordon, I don't know if I ever told you this before, but I ran down for 3 months looking for a marble pastry board because I was not going to get any marble or anything that was made in China, and I got something from Taiwan, and I thought, China hates Taiwan. This works for me perfectly. I love it. So, but not everybody can be that, not everybody's going to be that nuts about it. But honestly, that's really what it's going to take, right?
Absolutely, because with our everyday purchasing decisions, we are strengthening a regime that is using the proceeds to attack the United States. And let's be clear, China views the United States as an enemy. May 2019, People's Daily, which is the most authoritative publication in China, ran a piece that declared a quote-unquote people's war on us. You can't be any clearer than that. Biden says, China's not an adversary, it's not an enemy, it's just merely a competitor. No, it's not a competitor. It's our enemy. It's just that we have refused. We've got a political class, as you talked about, that refuses to recognize the hostility and the fundamental nature of China's challenge to us.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, how long is this window that we have where we have an export-dependent China that really does need America's purchase power? I get the sense that is limited, though.
It is limited in the sense that last year, China's merchandise trade surplus with the U.S. was 58.0% of its overall surplus. That number has generally been coming down over the last 3 or 4 years because it used to be over 100%. So I don't know how long that window will last because there are a lot of complicated issues in the Chinese economy right now. But the point is, however long it lasts, we need to take advantage of it. And we need to have a political leader like President Trump who is willing to use our leverage against the Chinese. Unfortunately, Biden isn't willing to do that.
Exactly. Definitely. He very much isn't willing to do that. You had a great point looking at this lab, because I was very curious about the 180-degree turn that media and a lot of Democrats were having about the lab leak theory. You had cited this piece from the New York Times where that top virologist there from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, they, in communist China, working at a communist Chinese controlled lab, telling the New York Times, no, there's nothing at all no truth to this this at all. You can believe me. And the New York Times ran this. You were essentially asking, why in the world would anybody believe this person who's very much in line with CCP? No, that's Communist China. Say no, nothing to see here. Trust us.
Yes. You know, if the Batwoman, as she's known, had made those comments when she was out of China and free of Chinese coercion, that's one thing. But obviously, she must be fearing for her life. And so therefore, those comments really deserve no credibility at all.
What do you attribute that 180-degree turn to? I mean, obviously, there was a lot of speculation that the dissident who fled China gave information to the United States, and maybe some of that intelligence made its way to the White House, and that's why. I mean, do you put stock in that?
Well, the defector that you might be referring to is Dong Jingwei, who there were defection rumors, but Beijing eventually released a photograph of him in China. But there are rumors of other defectors, and also some people say that he actually did defect to the U.S. but was returned. I don't know the truth of what's going on, but the point is that the reason why I think people in our country are starting to recognize the lab leak theory is because eventually truth has to win out. And that's what we have seen this year as people start to realize that, you know, President Trump could have been right about this. So I do think that there was just too much evidence showing that there was a lab leak for them to ignore it.
Yeah, absolutely. One last question for you. We're speaking with Gordon Chang, who's an expert in this area, the coming Chinese collapse. That's communist China's collapse. He's got a number of books. You had discussed the Solomon Islands premier, Daniel Sweetani. And I had never heard this story before, Gordon, until you had discussed this and you had shared it online. This premier, Solomon Islands, just, you know, tiny government, tiny populace, had stood up at the expense of even losing his own life to the communist Chinese government. And I think that's a great story, a great example for everybody as to if this guy can do it and the Solomon Islands can do it, everybody can. Tell everybody really quickly about the story.
Yeah, Daniel Sweetani is premier of one of the more important political units in the Solomon Islands. He was extremely sick. Beijing opposed him going anywhere in the world for medical treatment. Even Australia, one of our friends, refused him treatment. Taiwan took him in. And by the way, Dana, even though he's on a sick bed, he's still working to prevent Chinese from building bridges in his part of the Solomon Islands. This is a great story. I learned about it from Cleo Pascal of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And she and others have talked about this. And I was just really, like you, I was so inspired by Daniel Sweetani's courage.
Yeah, he was not even going to give communist China that optic of being nice to them. And I love the story. He didn't even have $100,000 for his own treatment, his health treatment. He wasn't going to allow the Communist Chinese Party to pay it. And I love the point, you mentioned Cleo Pascal, I love the point that she made in that, well, he shows that he wasn't bought off. He was an honest politician because he didn't have that kind of money. So rare. Gordon Chang, I so appreciate you joining us. Thank you so much. Safe travels, my friend.
Thank you, Dana.
Of course. Coming up, wait until you see IKEA'S. They have a love seats or settees. I don't even know the difference between those. But they have a new Pride collection, right? So spoiler alert here. It's fugly, and I'm not sure if it's a joke or not. Keep it here. Well, the LGBTQ advertising Olympics continues. They got one day to get it in. Come on. It's that time of the year when brands compete to show who is the most gay, the gayest of all, the most lesbian, the most pansexual, etc. And, you know, down with the LGBTQ movement during Pride Month. The competition's fierce this year. We've had Burger King's gay chicken sandwich, which took a poke at those fuddy-duddies over at Chick-fil-A, whose chicken sandwich is still identifying as straight, white, and Christian. We have the NFL letting us know that football is gay. I did learn that position is called a center. The guy who holds the ball and then the other guy puts the hands by the giblets. I get all that now. And now, this week's entry, a furniture line that captures every last spectrum of the rainbow, brought to you by IKEA. So the first question that I have is, does anybody actually want these love seats? I mean, if anything could throw off the feng shui in your home, it would be these art house disasters. And Honestly, it seems more offensive than a slur to gay people whose tasteful design aesthetics wouldn't allow them to be caught dead with one of these in their house. I mean, I have to say, our neighbors in our old house, they were gay. They had bottle service for their backyard cookouts. I would not ever see a sofa like this in their house, I gotta say. But alas, these sofas won't be found in any house. Okay, so I went on Twitter. We went on Twitter. We were learning about these IKEA love seats. They're not for sale, thank heavens. Of course they're not for sale, silly, because IKEA knows that they sell like 2 of them, and probably to a couple of like Antifa losers in Portland. In any case, this isn't about sales. It's about posturing for the LGBTQ community. And it gets me thinking, every generation rebels against the norms and social mores of the day. Clearly, the LGBTQ movement wants to push all boundaries. It's a form of rebellion too, but I wonder how rebellious is an LGBTQ movement that's being led by Lego and Burger King. I mean, we have Paw Patrol talking about trans parades and corporate stiffs like Roger Goodell talking about how cool it is to be gay. How do, fellow kids? I mean, how cool can it be with all these lame brands and corporate talking heads babbling about it all day? If geeks like Roger Goodell and lame fast food chains keep it up, they're gonna make being straight cool again. That does it for us tonight. Thanks for tuning in. Good night, and don't bend the knee.